Hello, and welcome to this presentation on making the environmental sciences. So today I'm going to share with you some of the research I've been doing for my PhD, which over the last few years has focused on exploring a history of the environmental sciences using the School of Environmental Sciences, ENV, at UEA, as its major case study. And so today for this presentation I'm focused on uncovering where the environmental sciences came from, both as an intellectual idea and as a university department. And this is quite important in the UK context because little is known about how the environmental sciences kind of came together as a new way of doing science and making knowledge. And it's also a relatively new branch in the history of science. And so today I'm going to share with you the ideas behind the School of Environmental Sciences, what they were, how they came about, what kind of socio-political conditions did they emerge in, what kind of enabled them, and all this kind of happens in a post-war Britain.
To begin then, concerns with the environment as we would recognise it today really emerged in the mid-20th century, with many kinds of precursory understandings of particular aspects of the environment existing before then. So, for instance, climate and external surroundings, resource and land use, various pollution concerns, various health concerns, with ENV being founded in 1967. And so Solly Zuckerman, who was a key scientific advisor in government and a member of UEA's academic planning board, was thought to have proposed the idea for the school in 1960, and this is kind of widely known in ENV. But ENV was also one of the first of its kind in the UK and in Europe. And so with this in mind, I seek to explore how and why Zuckerman came up with this idea and what were the conditions or contexts that allowed him to kind of cultivate this idea. And so this is very important to note because if we look to today, the environmental sciences have radically altered the way in which we live, both intentionally and unintentionally. They guide and influence policy, and they've even shaped the ways in which we may choose to live on an individual level. So I argue it's more than just a new form of science emerging, but instead it's a new form of science and society being co-produced. So there's a big question in exploring how this took hold and where it comes from, because it wasn't inevitable, and in science studies there are numerous factors that shape and reshape the way in which knowledge emerges, circulates, and is received. And this is what I've sought to explore in my research. And obviously, as I've previously mentioned, UK histories of the environmental sciences are really lacking. And so I'm looking to explore where and how this kind of came about. But first of all, who was Solly Zuckerman and how did he come up with this idea of the environmental sciences? Originally, Zuckerman was from South Africa. He studied medicine in South Africa and he came to London to finish it. And then he became an anatomist for the London Zoological Society. And it was during this time he became heavily interested in the anatomy of monkeys and apes. During this time also, he founded a dining club called Tots and Quats, where he and other intellectuals would meet, eat, and discuss varying challenges concerned with science and society. During this time, he met J.D. Bernal, a crystallographer and communist who believed deeply in the role of science in a centrally owned state. And he and others involved in this group published Science in War in 1940, which was a critique of the government's lacking use of science in the war effort, as they believed they could advise and solve many operational problems by treating the war rationally like a scientific problem. And after this, Zuckerman did eventually end up becoming involved in the war pretty soon after, through Bernal, when both were involved to advise on bombing tactics. And Bernal was to focus on buildings, and Zuckerman, more worryingly, was to focus on the human dimensions, based on his previous work with ape anatomy. But ultimately, the role of scientists in war was a success, and in the post-war period, Zuckerman and others became more heavily involved in civic and military committees. He was also a professor in anatomy at Birmingham University. And so, from this, science and scientists essentially infiltrated all of UK government, with Zuckerman now participating in many committees and advisory roles. And he's mentioned as a giant in government by Philip Gummit in his book Scientists in Whitehall. So it's important to remember that Zuckerman obviously wasn't the only scientist involved here, but he's key to the story. So the presence of scientists being involved in government affairs really signals a shift in governmental aims that I argue are conducive and favourable of scientific and technological futures, which is important for the idea of ENV. Zuckerman used his position and published widely on the need for scientists and technicians to satisfy the envisaged growing demand for scientists in society. He was also involved in a number of committees, the Advisory Council for Science Policy, which was concerned with scientific developments in government affairs, and this included a scientific manpower subgroup, which he was chair of, which looked at the graduate resource base, how it was lacking, and discussed possible solutions to this. Zuckerman was also involved in varying committees concerned with university funding, predominantly focused on the lack of science and technology courses, and natural resource use and concerns about this. Zuckerman ultimately ended up being the first chief scientific advisor in the 60s, I think it was 1964, to both Labour and Conservative governments. So while being involved in all of this, Zuckerman became aware of a number of strategical problems and knowledge gaps. For instance, depleting resources from growing populations and urbanisation, food insecurity as a result of this, toxicology and pollution issues from urbanisation as well, industrialisation and intensive agriculture, all these kind of issues that were starting to emerge in the mid-20th century. And I note that this is important for two key reasons. It reveals the authority in science in making issues known and the trust in science to find solutions for the problems. It also reveals a wide-spanning range of interrelated issues that were beginning to emerge that hadn't previously been linked together or hadn't needed to be linked together. And as a result, there was a lack of scientists or knowledge to effectively alleviate this. And interestingly, this was also the case elsewhere for conservation, with proposals for national nature reserves and national parks now being argued and centred around a conservation that was implemented on a scientific basis rather than recreation or heritage, with scientists like Julian Huxley and Arthur Tansley leading committees on that. But as a result of the challenges that Zuckerman was aware of, there was one solution proposed to the knowledge gaps. Zuckerman was asked to begin a discussion for a new research council, with civil servants and other academics. Originally it was centred around biology or natural resources, but these were eventually disregarded, and the name was an important topic of consideration as it was to define a new era of research for the emerging challenges in the mid-20th century that supported government, social, economic and industrial development aims. And so in the discussions in 1960, a few months before Zuckerman had proposed ENV, or had the idea for ENV, Roger Quirk, a senior civil servant who had worked with Zuckerman on a range of things previously, sent through this idea of an Environmental Sciences Research Council. And so I'm just going to read it out. The sciences dealing with the natural environment of water, air and the earth have come into prominence recently through such activities as the International Geophysical Year, the IGY. The basic theme of which was the interdependence of a wide range of sciences in this sphere: geophysics, geology, meteorology, oceanography, glaciology, marine biology, astronomy. Interest in space research and radio astronomy has drawn attention even beyond the atmosphere, but concurrently with this increase in interest, there have, in recent years, come to notice of the Advisory Council for Scientific Policy and the Office of the Minister for Science a number of deficiencies in the equipment, organisation and financing of the relevant fields of science. This, as he goes on to outline, incorporates the many challenges in agriculture, pollution and population, but was also to expand outwards, aligned with the growing global concerns of the interrelated sciences that came about from the IGY, geophysics, geology, meteorology, and so on. And that existing research organisation and government committees and ministers were currently unable to embark on. But Zuckerman's response to this is missing from the file, and it's a tantalising dead end because it ended up being a Natural Environment Research Council, with Sir Graham Sutton thought to have proposed the environment part to replace resources. And Sutton, who was the director of the Met Office at the time and was to become the director of NERC, argued that this emphasised more appropriately the wide-ranging scope of the new Research Council, much more than natural resources could have done. And so NERC came into being in 1965, and what I've hoped to show so far, it was a reaction response to growing challenges in the UK government and society that was understood and needing to be understood further through science. This is important as it signals that Zuckerman was exposed to the discourse surrounding the environmental sciences as a method of making knowledge and doing research for new challenges that was emerging globally through the IGY. And so we have this idea of the environmental sciences now swirling about in Zuckerman's head alongside of the discussions around what was to be NERC. And so now we have a rough idea of where the idea came from. We need to explore how it kind of came into fruition. I've already mentioned that Zuckerman published widely on the need for scientists and technologists in the late 50s. And at the same time, there was also a big push for higher education reforms in Britain. There was a post-war push for science and research after the success of the war, and the Percy Committee was developed and aimed to assess the challenges in education concerning Britain's position as an industrial and scientific leader. There were major concerns and worries in government about falling behind the science and technological development of the Soviet Union, USA, and the rest of Europe. And so, with the continued presence of scientific advisors in government, it was clear that something needed to be done, and universities were thought to be the best place to train future graduates and ensure that Britain kept up in pace with an adequate workforce. And so, with concerns emerging from the Percy report that degrees programs were too specialised, the University Grants Committee, who were in charge of distributing funds amongst existing universities, suggested that new universities were constructed to match the growing demand for science degrees, as it was cheaper to do this, and to widen university participation into smaller towns and cities. These ended up being universities in Sussex, UEA, of York, Lancaster, Kent, Essex, and Warwick. And this was then spearheaded by the Robbins Committee between 1961 and 1963, who took to task the details of the new universities. By this point, UEA was already being founded, but in this report, they discussed a whole wide range of things, including the criticism of degree specialisation again. And so, a quote from the report here: "There are long established and natural groupings of subjects. Chemistry, physics, and maths, and in the humanities, English with history and French are obvious examples. We are arguing that there should be also experiments in new combinations of subjects which have recognisably organic connections. This is an important point. Technology, for instance, with some social studies showing the more general implications of the technologist's profession, philosophy and maths with a history of science, and for many students, some study of the past as well as the present state of the disciplines they study." And so, as we can see, the appetite was there for new experimental combinations based on pre-existing disciplinary connections in the new universities. This actively created space for new environmental sciences to fill. The new universities then, with UEA being one of them, were called institutional experiments, and at the time of founding were not yet granted university college status and were more freely able to pursue interdisciplinary degree programs, and which is where Zuckerman comes in and proposed the idea of ENV, as he was also on the UA's academic planning board. So the idea of ENV was a broad interdisciplinary school that housed the interrelated disciplines that Quirk mentioned earlier on. And in doing so, Zuckerman notes scientists were to be trained broadly against earlier criticisms of narrow degree programs and putting in place the vision of a broad environmental science and environmental scientists. Zuckerman is also proposing a consumer for the funding of NERC, paving the way for new forms of scientific graduates for the future scientific society. And it was accepted by the academic planning board with no issue, and they set out to make the school a reality. Interestingly though, Zuckerman's involvement in the making of the school ends here, with the exception of being told that a new dean was hired and the school was underway in line with his original proposal. He returns later on when he retires from governmental duties and is made a professor in ENV, and he also organises a series of seminars. And after the school is developed and he retires from government, he then ends up talking at various international conferences about the environmental challenges associated with a future in science and technology. The next step then was to find a dean to bring the school to life and to begin helping with the hirings, developing a course curriculum, purchasing textbooks and equipment. And so it's widely known that this was Keith Clayton, pictured here. He was the first dean and he was relatively young at the time. And he, alongside Brian Funnell, were the first hires in N. But I don't think it's widely known that the search for the dean was not an easy one. And this went on for over a year, and it really illuminates the commitment to Zuckerman's original vision from the N working party, who were tasked to find a dean. They wouldn't hire anyone who wanted to take the school in their own direction, and because of this, the search for a dean went on for a long time, with Clayton applying originally in the first round. But the N working party did add geography to Zuckerman's original proposal, and this was thought to be able to be eligible for further forms of funding down the line, and to also attract and retain students for the school's longevity. And so once hired, Clayton set about to hire the staff over the next few years, and as the school grew, there was about 12 founding staff, all from geology and geography origins. But as the school grew, they were given freedom to develop their own courses in order to develop an interdisciplinary syllabus that would train students and introduce them to the breadth of this new environmental sciences that they were constructing themselves. And these students went out to transform the wider landscapes, for instance, in research, NGOs, other civic society organisations, in local authority and government, in consultancies and business. And in doing so, they imprinted this new way and new form of doing science that was taught to them and aided by the close proximity of a diverse range of individuals in one school, regardless of whether they were truly collaborating in interdisciplinary research. Analytically, then, I've explored the conditions behind the idea of N, and beyond this presentation, later on in my chapter, I'm trying to think through this idea of the environmental sciences from Zuckerman as a socio-technical imaginary, this being a collectively held, institutionally stabilised and publicly performed vision of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology as developed by Jasanoff and Kim. And so, thinking along these lines, I've revealed the socio-political conditions that shaped the original vision of the environmental sciences and the need for new universities and new interdisciplinary degree programs to train graduates for new visions of scientific and technological futures. But what does this ultimately say? As a socio-technical imaginary, the idea of the environmental sciences began from a collective discussion between Zuckerman, civil servants and other academics that came about ultimately due to the changing role and authority of science and government, the use of science as a component of future making and governance before being proposed by Zuckerman for ENV and UEA. This idea was then accepted and collectively held by the Working Party, who then passed on this vision to the new dean, and it was very important that the new dean remained committed to the original idea. The dean then hired the founding staff to make this vision a reality, who then in turn developed research and teaching programs in this light and shared it on to students, who then circulated this vision into further research of wider business and society, strengthening and stabilising as this went on. Zuckerman then came back into the 70s to reinforce his vision of a society aligned with the environmental sciences beyond academia, with government and business, through a series of transdisciplinary seminars dealing with varying aspects of environmental challenges and change, funded by the Ford Foundation in the US. So it wasn't just a response to knowledge gaps, but a new and profound way of knowing and living in the world. And so, unlike ENV, Lancaster had developed, as part of it being a university, a Department of Environmental Studies. So as a counter-imaginary, they embarked on an environmental program headed up by the already established and almost retired well-known climatologist Gordon Manley. But it was thought that Manley was persuaded by his colleagues and peers to head up the Environmental Studies Department as a way of reframing and rebranding physical geography, with many of the ENV Working Party criticising this approach, as they do not deal with the environment explicitly as a topic or a coherent whole. And so when Manley ended up retiring in 1968, Lancaster embarked on another direction in environmental studies, and this was something to be avoided by, according to the ENV Working Party, which is maybe why it didn't gain as much traction as ENV and UEA did. This needs some further exploration if and/or I get time to go to the archives. To sum up then, in a history and geography of science, this is an important case study against the existing literature and reveals the role of the university in environmental knowledge making. But the environmental sciences are relatively difficult to define, as is their wider relationship and effect on society and politics. And also, I've gone through this whole presentation talking about science, but we know there isn't a broad brush science out there, and it's actually made up of various disciplines with competing epistemologies and ontologies about how the world and why the world works. And so beyond this, later on in the thesis and in my other chapters, I explore the diverse and multiple environmental sciences through the elements that were not in Zuckerman's original idea, on the periphery and possibly excluded. So, for instance, I look at climate change research, local environmental management, and limnology to understand how they, in turn, also contributed to the wider evolution of the environmental sciences in ENV, but more broadly in society. Thank you for listening.